Electoral College hold on the White House. Karl Rove was repeatedly presented in major media profiles as a visionary Republican strategist who was far, far ahead, not just of other Republican strategic thinkers, but all political strategic thinkers in Washington in both parties. Those profiles were the product of the standard groupthink of the Washington Press Corps, and they all wildly exaggerated Karl Rove's genius. But what was true was that Karl Rove really was thinking about electoral politics for Republicans in a more careful and data-driven way than any other Republicans. It was also true that Karl Rove had a pretty good eye for potential political talent. Karl Rove signed up with George W. Bush in Texas because Rove believed correctly that George W. Bush could go all the way to the White House. And as soon as Karl Rove saw Kamala Harris 14 years ago in 2010, he was very worried about her.
We are the state that creates leadership for the rest of this country based on our belief that we can be tough and we can be smart and all the time be dedicated to our history while being empowered to know our destiny.
That was the night in 2010 when San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris won the Democratic nomination for Attorney General of the state of California. And that video was not seen anywhere outside of California. Karl Rove saw it. And that is when Karl Rove got scared, because Karl Rove saw the same track to the White House for Kamala Harris that I saw, beginning with her winning her first statewide race as Attorney General in California. That would leave Kamala Harris perfectly positioned, and it did leave her perfectly positioned to run statewide again for a United States Senate, which became possible when Senator Barbara Boxer decided not to run for re-election in 2016. Once in the Senate, Kamala Harris would obviously be a star who everyone would then expect to run for president. The key for Karl Rove was preventing Kamala Harris from winning statewide in the first place, stopping her in that Attorney General campaign. Karl Rove needed to turn Kamala Harris into a loser then so that she couldn't follow an Obama-like trajectory through the United States Senate to the presidency. It was that obvious to Karl Rove then. And so Karl Rove helped fund a negative advertising campaign against Kamala Harris in 2010. Joining me now from Los Angeles, California's Democratic Attorney General candidate Kamala Harris. Kamala, can you tell the country the story behind that ad that Karl Rove is running against you?
Well, Lawrence, about a week ago, we learned that Karl Rove and Gillespie put together about $1.1 million in money to fund an independent expenditure attack ad against my campaign focused on Los Angeles. We also learned that the expenditure was funded by tobacco, oil, and insurance companies. And as you have mentioned, there's a lot of speculation about why. But what that tells me is that they clearly know that we can win. And they obviously don't like our position on many of the issues that I believe are important, clearly not only to California, but the rest of the country.
Karl Rove was right. They needed to stop Kamala Harris then, or someday Republicans were going to be very worried in a campaign for president against Kamala Harris, as they are worried tonight. Kamala Harris won that first statewide campaign by less than 1% of the vote in California. And that is why she is where she is tonight. She is polling 4 points ahead of Donald Trump in the latest Wisconsin poll. The Marquette University Law School poll, the most trusted poll in Wisconsin, shows that among likely voters, Kamala Harris is polling at 52 in Wisconsin, and Donald Trump is polling at 48. That is in a state where the last two presidential elections have been decided by less than 1% of the vote. In 2016, Donald Trump won Wisconsin with 47.2% against Hillary Clinton's 46.5%. And in 2020, Joe Biden won Wisconsin with 49.4% against Donald Trump's 48.8%. That's how close it's supposed to be in Wisconsin. A 4-point gap in the Marquette poll in Wisconsin among likely voters is more than what Democrats could have reasonably hoped for at this point in the campaign. And that polling was completed before Wisconsin watched what Karl Rove saw in that debate, which Karl Rove describes this way. Ms. Harris was often on offense, leaving Mr. Trump visibly rattled as she launched rocket after rocket at him. A New York Times analysis found she spent 46% of her time on the attack, while Mr. Trump devoted 29% of his time to going after her. Debates aren't won on defense. Ms. Harris pressed Mr. Trump on the economy, the Ukraine war, foreign policy, health care, the January 6th attack, and especially abortion, leaving him flustered and often incoherent. Mr. Trump had to know the vice president would try to get him to lose his cool. She did. She went after him on his multiple indictments. She called him weak and belittled him as a 6-time bankrupt, spoiled inheritor of wealth. She said his former national security advisor thought him, in her words, dangerous and unfit for the Oval Office. He took the bait almost every time she put it on the hook. Rather than dismissing her attacks and launching his strongest counter-arguments against her, Mr. Trump got furious. As her attacks continued, his voice rose. He gripped the podium more often and more firmly. He grimaced and shook his head, at times responding with wild, fanciful rhetoric. Mr. Trump offered angry responses, pursed his lips, and eyes darting mostly down, seldom looking at her. And what was it with his makeup that left white circles around his eyes? Professional Republicans take Karl Rove very, very seriously. Big money Republican donors have always taken guidance from Karl Rove very, very seriously. They believe that Karl Rove really was Bush's brain, especially in campaigns. And so Republicans reading Karl Rove's assessment of the debate in the Wall Street Journal is as depressing as watching the debate was for those Republicans. Karl Rove continued, "It matters how debating candidates carry themselves. There, it was no contest. Ms. Harris came across as calm, confident, strong, and focused on the future. Mr. Trump came across as hot, angry, and fixated on the past, especially his own. She mastered the split screen, projecting confidence and wordlessly undercutting him by smiling while shaking her head as he spoke. Many undecided and swing voters will make up their minds less on any single issue than on their visceral reactions to the candidates. Ms. Harris did herself much good with that crowd Tuesday. Mr. Trump didn't. Even voters wanted to learn something new and reassuring about the candidates in the debate. She provided them plenty, while he didn't. There's no putting lipstick on this pig. Mr. Trump was crushed by a woman he previously dismissed as dumb as a rock, which raises the question, what does that make him? The answer to that question was provided by Kamala Harris in the debate.
I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace.
You know who won a debate when one candidate uses the debate in a campaign commercial and the other doesn't.
I want to turn to the issue of abortion.
For 52 years, they've been trying to get Roe v. Wade into the states. I did a great service in doing it. It took courage to do it. And the Supreme Court had great courage in doing it.
I have talked with women around our country. You want to talk about this is what people wanted? Pregnant women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, suffering from a miscarriage, being denied care in an emergency room because the healthcare providers are afraid they might go to jail, and she's bleeding out in a car in the parking lot. She didn't want that. Her husband didn't want that. A 12 or 13-year-old survivor of incest being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. They don't want that. I think the American people believe that certain freedoms, in particular the freedom to make decisions about one's own body, should not be made by the government.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Here is what debate winners say.
So North Carolina, 2 nights ago, Donald Trump and I had our debate. You watched it? Did you watch it? And look, I believe we owe it to have another debate. Right? We owe it to the voters.
Another debate. And here is what debate losers say. There will be no third debate. So says Donald Trump. Vice President Harris went to North Carolina today, where she has opened up the new possibility for Democrats to win the Electoral College with North Carolina's 16 electoral votes. The Democratic presidential candidate has not won North Carolina since 2008, when Barack Obama did it in his first presidential campaign. Donald Trump has won North Carolina twice now. If Donald Trump loses North Carolina this time, that would virtually eliminate any Trump chance of winning the Electoral College. With recent polls in North Carolina showing a 3-point gap between the candidates, the most recent poll shows Kamala Harris at 50 and Donald Trump at 47. If that's what happens on Election Day in North Carolina, Kamala Harris will be president. Here is North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper speaking to NBC's Nnamdi Egbuonu tonight after Vice President Harris's campaign event.
There's a reason why Donald Trump spent more money in August in North Carolina than any other state, because they're panicking. They know that Kamala Harris is at least tied or maybe even taking the lead in North Carolina. Donald Trump has no other path to the presidency. He must win North Carolina. We know that if Kamala Harris wins North Carolina, she is the next president of the United States. We did this in 2008. North Carolina voted for Barack Obama and made history. North Carolina is ready to make history again.
Here's Vice President Harris in Greensboro, North Carolina, earlier this evening.
Donald Trump intends to end the Affordable Care Act. Now think about that. Think about that. We remember what it meant when insurance companies could deny you for a pre-existing condition. Remember what that was? So he wants to get rid of it. And as he said in the debate, he made clear he has no plan to replace it. In fact, you remember? Concept. You remember? He has, quote, concepts of a plan. Concepts of a plan. I mean, we're 54 days from this election. Concepts of a plan. Which means no actual plan. Which means no actual plan. And 45 million Americans are insured through the Affordable Care Act. So understand what that means. He's going to end it based on a concept and take us back. So generations of Americans before us led the fight for freedom, and now the baton is in our hands. The baton is now in our hands. And we who believe then in the sacred freedom to vote will finally pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and